Cheers.
So I guess on the topic of the future, there seems to be in different disciplines like a different emotional sort of perspective towards the future. In ecology, it might be like very negative or very lots of anxiety. Maybe in software engineering, it's like very excited and optimistic. And like in your sort of industries, do you feel that it's overall positive or negative? And do you think overall does humanity have like a positive or a negative perspective of the future?
Interesting. Do you mean positive and negative or pleasant and unpleasant? I think it would depend on which of my industries you're looking at. So I think that my personal experience of ecologists is that there are a lot of them that are very concerned and anxious about the future. But I think that in the science communication sphere, I think a lot of us are motivated by the fact that we might be able to do something about it. And so we tend to be more optimistic, if not positive.
I think Stephen Pinker and Hans Rosling have addressed this, haven't they, really? I mean, I think in Pinker's last two books, he was really just arguing against the notion that we're heading to hell in a handbasket. That actually things are getting better. So there's an assumption that things are getting worse. The data suggests that perhaps things are getting better.
For humans, not for the rest of the world, unfortunately.
That could be true.
The catastrophe of the environment, I think, that's the whopper.
I mean, if you smooth out curves and you can see trends, it does seem as though things are getting better, but there's always the prospect of, the increasing power of technology, nuclear technology, artificial intelligence, biotech, for a spike to cause something really disastrous to happen. So on average, maybe things are getting better, but, a destabilizing catastrophic spike, could cause a lot of disaster. What are your thoughts on the ideas of global catastrophic events? Do we need to consider them, or do we just say, oh no, everything's getting better?
It would be very foolish to not consider them. I think the crux of my work is that we don't consider them enough, or we consider the next election cycle and that's it. And I think the worry is that if we consider, oh, well, things are pretty dire, we can't do anything about it anyway, so let's not worry about it, because that's what happens if you consider it too much. And I think that there's a lot of room for optimism as well as consideration of potential apocalypse. But I think it's too easy to I think a lot of the time animals that are going extinct particularly, people will go, well, it's already too far along, let's, the conservation triage idea is that you have some animals that you think you can save, so you work on those more than you do on the others, or plants, or any other organism for that matter. But the danger with that is if you go, okay, there's nothing we can do about this species here, let's not waste money on it, then that would be great if that money goes into the rescuing of those other species, but that doesn't necessarily happen.
Human cooperation tends to nosedive under threat. I think if you starve people of resources, they'll probably become less cooperative, less, so you do need to worry about those things.
Desperate people do desperate things.
But moralistically though, from a human perspective, what gives us the right to say we can choose one animal species over another? And are we playing God?
Oh, well, it's an interesting question to ask an atheist. I think...
Why do we let nature just run its course?
Oh, well, that's interesting. So I have an argument with my sister about whales washing up on beaches. We don't really know why they do it, although there's plenty of speculation as to why they might. But my sister says if the whales have chosen to beach themselves, maybe we should just leave them there to die. And my argument is that regardless of the reasons the whales have beached themselves, we are putting whales as a whole taxonomic group under so much pressure throughout the whole of the oceans, then maybe if we can save those 3, 4, 5, 50 then it might be worth our while because we don't know whether we might need them and all the things that they stand for in the future. I don't think it's that we necessarily moralistically have a right to choose one species over another. I think that morally we have to choose humans first, and none of what I said is to argue that any other organism should come before humans, or even all of the organisms should come before humans. Only that there's good evidence to suggest that if we don't look after the other life on the planet, we're going to be very sorry from a human perspective. But I think it's not so much that we would choose one species over another, it's just that for some species the situation is so dire that we would need to we could better spend those resources elsewhere because it's too late for them already.
With complex societies and things, there being a bit of a game theory of like the best interests of the individual and their life choices might not always be aligned to the best interests of the collective. How closely aligned are the best interests of individuals to the collective good now? And as we're moving into the future, is the temptations going to get wider or narrower? Like, I guess, for example, if you're a doctor in a developing country, are tempted to just leave your community and go to where there's better money. Or a software engineer could spend more money gaming human psychology rather than genuinely connecting people, like, 'cause there's more money. Like, how closely aligned is the common good to your personal incentive? Is that going to change?
Personally, I just think the trouble is that we're tribal creatures, and social media
Don't understand that the reason they're being dismissed is because what they've stated is not an opinion.
Right.
So if people say, I don't like that, that's a very nice opinion. But if they say climate change doesn't exist, that's not an opinion, that's crap. And so I think that it's important to have people involved to get them to understand it a bit better.
Yeah.
But I don't think that people should have input necessarily, except in the cases of citizen science, which is just a great method to involve people in stewardship for science.
And what do you think will happen if the singularity occurs?
The singularity, what do you mean?
Machines getting smarter than humans.
Oh, I see. Oh gosh, I don't know. I think they say that the basic difference between an economist and an ecologist is that an ecologist thinks that machines won't save the world, but an economist does. I know, you probably know.
I don't know. I don't see the singularity forming a human-like mind. I think if AI's developed, talk about consciousness, or I don't see it happening. But it could well happen, but it won't be like we're conceiving.
Yeah.
So you think a singularity could take the form of like something, a weird alien-like intelligence that's way
But
smarter than us?
it wouldn't embody the same, way of navigating the world, perceiving the world, priorities in the world. That we're presuming to be like us but faster. But it'll be a thing that's something else. It'll if it ever happens. I'm personally, I don't know. I don't think so. Because it's like they say, if you have computer graphics of a black hole, why isn't it create a gravitational well that it won't, because it's a representation of it. And a lot of the AI, it's more of pattern surfing and recognition, I think, anyway.
So, similar question, but on a different tangent, hopefully. The last presentation was a really good example of how the future of education is going to be based on augmented reality and virtual reality. It's just a matter of time before we all have glasses or brain implants or whatever, and we're seeing all sorts of different overlays. And I think that there's lots of positives that can be done, as you've shown. I think the other side of that is you're going to have these complex worlds. You've already got kids on video games at the moment who are often quite depressed, so you've got the whole happiness situation. You've got these really rich virtual worlds, which, for all intents and purposes, would be perceived to have great diverse ecosystems. So how do you ensure that through education and these kind of tools, you keep engagement with new generations to actually look after themselves and the natural world? I suppose that's my question, combining the three things we've seen today.
Teaching kids to value the natural environment while they're on screens. It's possible, but I know it's tricky because it's very compelling and very enveloping and wonderful, these worlds that kids are and we're very good at that kind of entertainment, and it can be very educational. There's a lot of people with serious games. It's a huge area where they're putting a lot of money into making games so that they are educational. There's very few examples I think that are successful. Anyway. So I don't know.
Think of the kind of Ready Player One scenario where the world's gone to pot, but got access to it.
I think that's very likely. That's going to be it can be our escape from this world, and it's going to be as wonderful as you want it to be. Your lush forest. So.
I think it's hard to measure that as well. Like, I think our measurements of whether you feel any more attached to the natural world before and after playing a computer game are not very sophisticated. I think we measure some very basic things about, the impact of a particular piece of art or something. Whereas it's so much more complex a picture than we really see it as. And I think that a lot of the time with games that try to educate, for example, there's a very good intent there, and there's a lot of potential for educating and encouragement of intrinsic value, for example. But I think that I don't think we really know at the moment how effective that is. You guys probably know better than I do, but yeah, I think it's, I work in television, and there are examples of things like War on Waste, which measured a distinct difference from before the programme went to air of how many people use keep cups and after the programme went to air, and it was a significant number of people, because of that show, started using a keep cup. But that is one tiny measure of a tiny part of a short-term solution to a massive problem. And so I think it's, and again, I'm an ecologist, not an economist, right? So it seems hard for me to believe that a computer game can change the world.
What will change the world?
Change itself,
Do you
really.
reckon the scientists or the business people are going to change the world? Or have more of an active part in changing what we currently know as the world?
I think that, evolution happens on a micro scale as well as on a macro scale, right? And so just by us being here to this evening, we've changed the course of the planet. But I think that until ecosystems are really truly valued from a monetary perspective, the chances are it won't really change. So whether the answer to that is scientists or businessmen, or most likely both, and politicians as well, of course.
They have to agree though.
Yeah, that's
And
right.
often they don't.
That's right, absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely.
So a good question. I think based on what you just showed us, like this models and this kind of algorithms, because recently I was interested in this so much, I was thinking about maybe in the near future we can have new forms of encyclopedia, like, because now we're just still based on the video stuff, like words and videos we switch off to learn things. And I think when that really happen in the next 5 or 10 years, we can use some kind of advanced reality to interact with those and zoom in, zoom out, with all of sort of things. Like in the biology area and psychology area, will that have a huge benefit for study and for other people to understand your research? Yeah.
I guess the more multimodal it is, the easier it is to engage with, the better you can learn, and the quicker you can learn. So yeah, I'd suggest so. I mean, if you move from words to zoom out, zoom in, visualization, you've got more modes, so you'll be able to learn better, and I think it'll be more adaptive. Yeah.
Wikipedia's begun that feature. There are some interactive.
But there are so many new opportunities for creating all sorts of different forms of media. They all have pluses and minuses. Text is not going anywhere. It's going to be very much it's a very direct, very powerful way of communicating. Illustrations and images are great. And when they test the animations like this or versus a static illustration, there's a lot of research that I contribute my animations to be tested, and they tend to show that you don't actually learn much. You don't really learn any more from the animation, but you get much more engaged, and you do, like, there's other things that happen from this kind of media. But the point is, this isn't the solution. It's just yet another way of learning, each one, it takes time to sit through an animation, where it's quicker to look at an illustration, so you have to experience the whole dynamics so there's pluses and minuses with everything, and there are different kinds of information that's been conveyed, and so it's all valid. I don't think this is a replacement for anything. It's just yet another way of getting kids engaged, getting them linked forward into the screen rather than just go, tell me what's going on. So
I think one of the things I really like about projects like yours is that education is so dependent on where you are and how much money your school has. So, what the schools that have access to a larger budget are more likely to have incursions and experiments and demonstrations and all the rest of it. And the other end of the scale, the schools that don't have such a large budget are using the same textbooks that their parents used, and it's out-of-date material, and it's not engaging as engaging as the demonstrations and the incursions and the rest of it. And I think that it's really great to see projects like yours that will really, really help those students that would otherwise miss out on so much or otherwise without.
Anything that can reduce, my biology books were that big back in the day. Anything that can reduce that?
No, I say the opposite. You want bigger. You have no idea. Like 1,000 pages is pleasure. It's, oh my god.
Yeah.
So and the thing is, the textbooks are ballooning with what we're discovering too.
Yeah.
So how do we navigate that? That's tricky.
Well, what do you see on the horizon in developments in understanding human psychology? Do you see it's always for instance, looking at the brain scans, trying to develop systems that sort of crystallize models of what could be valence in the brain? Is there any sort of insights that you might have, speculatively now, of course, but where you see psychology moving forward, instead of just being more behavioural, but yeah. So do you think psychology will be less behavioural in the future and will be more neuropsychology in that direction?
Well, I think most of it is trying to predict behaviour, right? No one really cares about what's going inside my brain right now. So
Really?
it only matters to the extent that it leads me to behave in the world, which impacts on you, and therefore that's what we want to predict is behaviour. So it's all about what parts of us predict that. So yeah, I think psychology is always going to be 100% about behaviour. It's about predicting humans and their behaviour in the world. Yeah, so I don't think that'll change.
What about other organisms like animals?
I don't know.
Understanding how they sense the world and navigate it, or how they interpret, or like a worm and how it's tiny little, very primitive eyes or sensing the direction of light.
Yeah.
That sort of thing is what you mean?
Well, I'm thinking for instance, if we wanted to, if we were moral philosophers drawing on psychology, how would we know what experience actually qualifies as being subversive or pleasurable? Where do they sit on the hedonic range? And what patterns relate to suffering? What patterns relate to joy? What patterns relate to novel experience and those sorts of things?
I think when it comes to other animals, I think that...
How do we know that chickens are suffering, for instance?
Well, and that's a very good question. And there have been studies fairly recently with dogs and recognition of humans and how, it lights up certain parts of their brains. They train dogs to lie still in an MRI and then show them pictures of people that they know and smiling faces and all this sort of stuff. And I think that sort of stuff is really interesting and potentially very important. And but I don't think the old-fashioned studies will go out. Old-fashioned being, what leads to behaviour. Apologies, I wasn't meant to be derogatory at all. But I guess my point is, in the future, I think that the cheaper and more accessible technologies become, the more inclined scientists are to use them just for the sake of just the benefit of learning from that experiment itself. So, when it came to speciation back in the day, people studied the difference between species by what they could see in the field, and they would draw them with a pen. But now we use genetics, and that's not necessarily because it's any better or any worse, or any better, but because we have that that's accessible, and and it's cheaper than it used to be, and so my guess would be that when it comes to animal behaviour, for example, nobody at the moment, not many people care whether chickens feel pain or not. They need to use them for food. So, you know, they become a food item first and a sentient being second. But in the future, when those techniques become accessible to study the chicken brain and to be able to work out whether it's feeling pain or not, we're going to be more inclined to use those technologies than we currently are, I would suggest.
Right. Okay. So if we have provable models to show that, like, chickens are suffering, or pigs are suffering, or animals are, you know, under certain conditions are suffering, then do you think we'll use that to inform the way that we behave in the world in ways that we don't at the moment, because we just don't have access to that
That's
information?
a good question, and one would say that surely because we can see evidence for climate change and the damage that it causes, we would do something about that too.
Yeah.
And I don't know the answer.
Are you starting to notice in your own fields a little bit more geographic diversity in the participants in your field? Like, you know, I'm a programmer. I'm starting to see a lot more code coming from China and a lot more Chinese language materials coming up. Is in your fields, is there much change happening, or is it all still very English based, sort of US, West European, like?
Certainly for me, it's been the US has been by far the funder of this sort of technology development.
Yeah.
But I certainly see it changing, and certainly China's just, I don't actually know what's going on in China, but the impression is from the discussions and the sort of hiring of large teams of animators going over to train thousands of animators to do bigger productions and stuff like that cheaper. It seems like a lot of money is being invested by China, and similar to my peers, to what's going on. But US has been dominant, but it's certainly stumbling now. And Europe is trying to do like what US has been doing. So I tap into that a bit too. But it's nowhere near the scale that the US has been. But the US did slow down with the economic downturn, and it's just picking up again. This is talking about philanthropy and where they're investing in these sorts of high-end education materials.
It's interesting actually, because conservation is largely the domain of rich nations, because a lot of the poor nations are just trying to bloody feed their people. And and actually it's a very important point that conservation biology and ecology and even science communication is largely dominated by the richer countries, because they have the resources and the education to do something about it. Whereas I think that a lot of the countries that, and it's a really valid point that we can't possibly begin to expect countries that can't feed all its people or that don't have access to clean water for every one of its population to take on board things like climate change and that sort of thing.
Is it expensive to be moral as a society?
Well,
if we didn't have money, would that mean we were unable to be moral?
But I think you're confusing morality with action. So it's not to say that people that can't afford to feed themselves don't think that it's a good idea to do something about climate change, but whether they have access to the education and the resources to be able to do anything about it is a different story.
I beg to differ. I think it's actually political, because if you look in countries like the Middle East, they've got the money, but they don't spend on ecology.
Absolutely, you're absolutely right, but that is a different example though. Like I think it's completely political, to be honest. That's my opinion. I think it's completely political, and I think that governments aren't doing enough, and they're just closing a blind eye. Right. And
Yeah.
I mean, of course, everything is political in the sense that the countries that are poor are more likely to have corrupt governments, and that's a lot of the time why people can't feed themselves, because of corrupt politics, not because there isn't enough resources to go around.
Is it true that Australia has the highest per capita production of CO2?
It was last time I saw. I don't know whether that's still the case, but yeah, back in the days when we said we could ratify the Geneva Convention, but we're not going to, then yeah, that was definitely the case back then.
So it's up to us to pull our finger out, rather than say, oh well, they're not doing anything, or they're not doing anything.
That's right. And countries like China and India that are finally getting some kind of industrial and educational revolution, I don't think it's fair for us to say they shouldn't be burning the fossil fuels because we did. Just because we think that now we know better doesn't mean that we should take their economic growth away from them. And these are questions to which we don't have any answers, or I don't have any answers anyway. But I think that if you see the average person on the street in a lot of countries, their awareness of things like climate change and biodiversity loss varies depending on, for example, their education, which might well be political and often is, but is also a factor of money because they've got to go out to work when they're young, and those are still very big issues for a lot of people around the world. Whether their governments know about it and choose not to do anything about it is a different story, but yeah, there's a good proportion of the population of the world that don't have the resources to be able to do anything about it.
Do you have any questions for each other? Are you curious about each other's presentations? Do you have any points of contention, disagreements?
Not at this late stage.
Yeah.
I'd like to ask you, Brockbeck, optimism, because I'm obviously an optimist, and I feel like I have to be as well, because if I were to give the pessimistic version of that, there would be no future. But is it foolish to be optimistic?
No, it's just foolish to be totally always optimistic, that's all. Yeah. I think that's what led to the global financial crisis, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Rampant optimism. So a balance, everything in balance, yeah.
So it sounds like you're saying we should use these filters of optimism or pessimism, sadness or happiness to look at the world. I mean, can't we just look at the world in an unbiased, unemotional, completely clinical, analytical manner?
Some people can, but they're...
Do you think it's worth trying to train to be able to, get into that mode where we can sort of look at things in an impartial way? What do you think?
Your biology, though, like, your feelings or your intuitions or how you can make your choices and stuff. It's not your rational facts that are doing anything. You're not making any decisions based on that.
We might be able to change our biology at some point.
That's and then what does that mean in the sense of what sort of minds would we have? I don't know what that means.
Do you think we can morally enhance ourselves?
Who's deciding what's moral though? Like, what sort of changes are you going to implement?
Well, the thing is, I mean, unless we have to be as objective as possible about what counts as morality. If you're a subjectivist, then there's no mutual ground in which anybody can really stand on and say, well, that's wrong or that's right, or to make any judgment about anybody else's behaviour. But we do make judges about other people's behaviour quite a lot, and it doesn't mean that we can't do that. In other words, are you a complete relativist? Do you think there's no way that we can make sort of group decisions on what's right and wrong? Because everybody is in an island unto their own self and has their own sort of moral code.
The trouble is with rationality, I say as a scientist and a person that does my best to live by rationality and reason and evidence, is that it takes time for those sorts of things. So, I think if we were to say, all right, we should leave Europe for whatever reason, it then takes, apparently, months and months and months to come up with a plan. And so, there are questions that we have about our actions on a day-to-day basis for which we have no evidence, for which we can apply rational reason to all we like, but the answers just aren't there. And so that, I think, is the biggest problem with evidence-based rationality, is that it doesn't always work.
There's not enough evidence. Is that the question?
But we don't have access to enough evidence.
Yeah, sure.
But isn't the fact that we go to work day to day, we have a boss, isn't that in itself groups doing something because they just have to make money?
Not following.
Isn't that the same sort of thing?
Yeah, absolutely. And and there's lots of examples of that, right? Like a government and like all of us sitting in a room here now.
We're kind of programmed in a way to do things.
Because
I think humans and machines are the same. But that's my moral stance though. But
Right,
yeah.
right.
Okay.
I know, so I mean, So then the questions are things like, if this species is going to go extinct, do we look after it or not? You know, and then you have to judge the evidence. And there are lots of things to which we don't know the answer and never will be able to find the answer.
So we don't want to know the answer.
Well, what do you think about the moral worth of generations that have not yet, are yet to exist, that could exist if we were to make the choices that would be more amenable to generations in the future existing? Should we be caring about the billions of years left in the rest of the universe and possible generations of life, living fulfilling lives? Is that
You're not going to
something?
motivate people by this story, though. Like it's not.
Oh, I think you can motivate a lot of philosophers.
But again, that's like why I'm so despondent about social media and what is going on right now, and how our tribalism just ramped up to 11. And there's some confusion and just the gaslighting that goes on, where you just spread just crap, and then everyone gets confused, and then nothing happens. And it's the way we're all being played that way, and then we're getting very, very good at it. And there's a lot of money being made and a lot of power being moved around. I just don't. It requires really a singular vision that is right and that it leads all of us. But I just don't. I think we're fracturing away. We're all in our little bubbles of information, at least in the Western, or in the technological society. We're just these cycles of bad information and people manipulating other people.
Do you think that will be subject to a Darwinian process, though? Societies that fracture and get invaded or conquered or dominated intellectually or physically? And
we know that's happened in the past, or at least people like Jared Diamond argue that it has. That absolutely these civilizations that don't pull their act together, they don't survive. And that is the big question, right, about the future is should we try to survive? If so, why should we? Does it matter?
But then what about societies like the Incas and societies like the Egyptians? They were meant to be the most highly evolved, yet they faked out.
So the trouble with evolution is it doesn't have an endpoint. So evolution is just the path of it moving. There's no, the human being isn't the most evolved animal. Mm-hmm. Evolution is only a measure of how adapted you are to your environment. And so the Inca might have been sophisticated. They might have had great science and might have had, well-being and understanding. Mm-hmm. But if they weren't adapted to the Spanish encroachment, then that was the end of that. Yeah. Mm. Yeah.
There's a huge controversy around how it's got extinct. Some people think they left the planet, other people think there's a huge convoluted issue about it. But going back to my previous thing, maybe we need to look at science in a different way. Maybe we need to stop thinking that we're the best and
There's still Quechua people all through the Andes,
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, there are.
Well, okay, so if we're trying to figure out a better way to survive and flourish, you said there's got to be a better way, but how do we find that out? How do we discover what that is? What are your thoughts on trying to find out what is that better way?
It's really big questions. I don't really know how to answer.
Yeah.
To be honest.
You got any intuitions?
I think we're doing the best we can.
Yep.
I think that's what we're doing.
That's what we do, and this evolution will happen, but that also means a lot of extinction or a lot of things that don't succeed, and whatever survives may not be the perfect thing, but it's to have a survived situation. Then you have to work with what's left. Like that is what's going to now occupy the evolving space. So it's not just a movement towards perfection. It's just a dealing with what we have right now. And then what's left over can then move on in life. So, so I it's going to be messy, and it's not going to be directed. And I wonder if it's under our control.
Well, that is interesting what you just said about if civilization does go belly up. Is there anything that we're doing now to try and make sure at least some aspects that we think are valuable survive, like the information, and trying to preserve some message about what went wrong?
But do the Incas care that we were coveting their gold? Not really. They would much rather be alive. I mean, so we've been preserved for future whatever alien beings to, or when the squids take over the world, after we're long gone, they may dig up our evidence of our. But I don't know. I'd rather we survive in the first place.
Yeah, I'd
I
rather we
have
survive
to
too, sure.
make a point. The Incas were actually the royal family. The people were the Quechua people, and they're still there.
Yeah, they are.
Then the Aztecs disappeared with ecological collapse, wasn't it? Or one of the groups of people, they think it was an ecological disaster,
Yeah, no,
or
definitely.
a huge drought happened or something, and it was all over and acidified. So anyway, that's where we're heading.
Mayans.
With the mines, yeah.
I have this idea that taps in your three expertise actually, so I'd like to have your opinion. A few years ago I was thinking, because humans seems to first focus on avoiding short-term loss, and then focus on short-term gain, and then far behind it's like a long-term loss, right? So here it's all about long-term loss. We can't really see, or most of us can't see the impacts of our everyday behavior into the future of the planet and beings and everything, and food and basically everything. So I was thinking, couldn't we kind of do a augmented reality on some sort of Google Street View, where you could see the impact of what you're doing today on things and places you care about today, and kind of simulate in the future, so you could actually visit the impact of, okay, if I do too much of this today, then this beautiful beach I love spending my holidays every year during summer, then it's going to be flooded by storms and by like rains, and this kind of meat I love to eat and buy at the supermarket won't be available to me anymore for burgers or whatever. So yeah, the side of things that would work for people to change their behavior today. Do you think this can be done, this kind of simulation could be done, like figured out in Google
Like
Street?
speculative, sort of simulating speculative futures based on current actions, in a visual way that people can sort of interact with.
If you saw the CO2 that's actually being generated because of the power plant, so you can use your VR to look at the data. So you can realize if you took the goggles off and turned it all off and just went out and had a sit in the park, you'll have better impact than, it's sort of, I don't know, it's also the consumption of precious metals that go into, rare metals, rare earths that go into this sort of technology too, being stripped out of the land so that we can develop this technology to look at this representation of the forest and try and think about how, it's sort of, we have to deal with the impact of all this technology on what's actually happening to the ecology and the life, the living part of the planet. I am very conscious of what it goes into consumed to make this sort of technology come about. We have to find some answers to that. Like it's hopefully, and also to inspire kids to go out and experience the real world out there rather than purely on computers. That's why again I think we need all of these forms of media. This type of technology is very, very compelling. It's very addictive. It tells great stories. We're storytelling creatures. It's every bit as powerful as cinema. We're only in the early days of developing a grammar of how to navigate and explain or convey things in it. But I think it's wonderful, but I only think it is one part, and I am worried about its impact on the physical world.
I think what it takes people to change their behaviour in things like the environment is so personal to each person, because we have beaches that have been destroyed, we have forests that have been destroyed, we have examples of these things, and I think what my concern would be that you could do all that work, and on the basis of it, I like the idea. I think it's a great principle, but I think people already know that they're at risk from various things, and that we as a species are at risk from various things. And yet we have this cognitive dissonance where we understand that it's an issue and that we shouldn't drive the car, but I'm tired, so I'm going to, or make excuses for it, and so on and so forth. And I think it's got a lot of potential, but I think to really find out how it would be most powerful would be a really interesting question to work out exactly what it is that people need to see, because maybe whatever it is that they need to see already exists.
And it's always, if you want people to change, you have to tap into their feelings. So like that when you see the starving African kid, a young girl who's starving will raise more money. You'll give more money to a person to do that. If she has her family around her in the image, you'll give less money because it's starting to be and then if you say, oh, there's 500,000 kids just like her, you lose the emotional connection, you don't give any money. So it's these personal, singular stories that are motivate us. So seeing the ecological damage or the long-term damage, it just doesn't motivate people. It's not a story.
No, so what I was referring is to simulate it on the things you know for yourself. So you would see, for instance, your daughter being an adult and not being able to feed herself anymore properly and stuff like that.
Or their house
so really stuff that
underwater.
touch your life and the people and the things you care about, not distant times which doesn't relate to you.
Yeah. I think it's got a lot of potential from that perspective, because I think if people, could see their own home underwater and see that they've only got 14 years left to do something about it.
Yeah, so
but the question is, would they then go, all right, we need to exact global behavioural change, or would they go, shit, I better move? And that's the concern.
Fantastic. It's been wonderful. Thank you very much. Really appreciate your time and
Thank you
energy and
for coming
effort,
out.
and thanks for everybody for coming along.